JEM Publishing presents the unabridged recording of Rescuing Melissa, The Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1, written by Ellie Masters, narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes. 21. Check-in. Melissa. The hotel wasn't super fancy, but it was the nicest in town. Melissa found herself bracketed by CJ and his friend Mac. They escorted her through the lobby. Each carried one of her suitcases. Jenny remained with the car, stating she had calls to make. Scott had been in her house. He defiled her home. Her heart raced, and all she wanted to do was run and hide. Go so far away, Scott would never find her. But he would. He would track her to the ends of the earth.
You doing okay?
CJ cupped her elbow, lending support. Each step drained energy from her body. Pain surged and flashed, and she was tired of pretending she didn't hurt everywhere at once. She held herself stiffly, afraid to twist or bend. But movement was inevitable and pain unavoidable. As much as her body suffered, it was her heart which pained her the most. Scott had broken it years ago, and killing that woman in her home? He left her heart ripped and shredded to pieces. Just overwhelmed. She scanned the hotel lobby, her skin sweating with nerves. Mac had seen a man running out of her yard. If Scott had followed them, she'd be in no condition to run, let alone defend herself. She may have stretched the truth with Dr. Sims. Her nurse had been suspicious, and Charles questioned whether she was well enough to go home. He might have been right. Another day or two in the hospital might have been a better choice. Too late now.
You don't look good.
When Mac spoke, it sounded like the rumbling of distant thunder.
Look like you're about ready to keel over.
Sharp shards of pain lanced through her side as she took another step. He might be right. She bit her lip and hoped no one noticed. Sweat beaded on her brow, and her forehead flushed. Breath labored into her chest, tugging in tight little gasps, as if her body was determined to make as little movement as possible and minimize the pain. I think I just need to lie down for a bit. She closed her eyes and prayed for strength. All she had to do was make it to the room upstairs, then she could rest. Spots danced in her vision, and the room swayed under her feet. She blinked against vertigo, forcing her mind to alertness and her body to endure. I will not pass out. Despite the soreness of her body, a constant throb and ache, her mind remained alert. The shock of the last few hours penetrated deep, but she wasn't defeated. If anything, the experience hardened her determination. She wouldn't let Scott break her no matter how hard he tried. A quaint 3-bedroom. Her house was a far cry from the monstrous estate she had lived in with Scott. It had taken her nearly 2 years after his incarceration to work up the courage to move. The day she filed divorce papers, she shut the door for good. The estate sat empty and neglected now, deteriorating over time. Selling it hadn't been an option. His family wouldn't allow the sale, despite what their son had done. The Patterson family home now rotted like everything else Scott had touched. CJ gave her the once-over as if making sure she was doing okay. If only he knew how close she was to complete collapse. She smiled, pretending all was well. Nothing could be further from the truth. Somehow, she managed to convince him, because he continued forward, guiding her through the crowds of the spacious hotel lobby. He said he worked for a firm which consulted with the FBI, and now he knew her darkest secret. Wife of a serial killer, she couldn't be more cursed. Oddly, he hadn't abandoned her to face this horror alone. How long he would be with her, she didn't know, but was glad for whatever stolen time she could take. Now that she knew a little about what he did, she caught the way he surveyed the room. He watched not only her but those around him, his eyes scanning the lobby and keeping a lookout for threats. As vulnerable as she felt, it was nice to know someone trustworthy was looking out for her well-being. Slowly, they made their way to the check-in counter. All she wanted was to forget who she was, or better yet, disappear. Years ago, the cops questioned her like they'd done today. Back then, they confined her for 2 days while the interminable questioning continued. Thank goodness the same hadn't happened today. Would she ever be free of her ex? He'd been an abusive husband, cruel in so many ways, but she had stood by him. It was expected as a wife, and he told her what he would do if she ever left him. Her shoulders slumped, and she could barely hold her head up. CJ glanced at her, concern tugging at the corners of his eyes while he checked in at the registration desk. He handed the suitcase he was carrying to Mac.
Take this, please.
Mac grabbed the bag and CJ wrapped an arm around her shoulders.
Just a little longer.
It was time to be strong. She'd been through this before and would get through it again. She could get a gun, even hire a bodyguard until she figured out how to leave town. How did someone disappear? Scott wouldn't stop looking. All she had for now was CJ. For now, she would trust him and not worry about the details. But despite CJ's pledge to protect, he didn't know Scott. Her husband never failed once he set his mind to a task, and he meant to punish her for leaving him to die. The receptionist behind the counter handed CJ the card keys to the room. Mac stepped away to survey the lobby and its attendant guests. CJ guided her to a bank of elevators, pressing his hand to the small of her back. Ever protective, he remained by her side.
Room's on the 18th floor,
CJ said. Mac shadowed them, joining them at the elevator. He put out a hand, preventing a couple from entering the elevator. The man huffed, while the woman gave an indignant snort. When Mac took half a step forward, both their expressions changed. The doors closed, leaving the three of them alone inside the glass elevator. Mac said,
I'll help you to the room and then talk to security. Thanks. I appreciate it. Jenny needs you, so be quick. Sweep the room with me, then go. I'll wait until the rest of our team shows up, then call you.
He jabbed the button for the 18th floor and they rode up in silence. She vented a deep sigh.
You don't look so good.
He placed the back of his hand on her forehead.
You feel clammy.
Not wanting him to touch her, she took a step back. She couldn't stand any more kindness from this man, but she wanted it desperately. I'm fine. Just tired and sore. From his expression, he didn't believe her, but he didn't press. Mac said nothing and did a great job holding up his end of the silence for the rest of the elevator ride. Heights made her dizzy, so she avoided looking out of the glass to the lobby falling away beneath them. Finally, the doors opened, and CJ strode out, leaving Mac to manage the suitcases. Melissa swayed on her feet as her vision spotted and dimmed. Mac leaned over.
You okay?
Just dizzy. She flashed him a fake smile. It's been a long day, and I don't like heights. He leaned down, tucked one of her suitcases under his arm, and grabbed the other in the same hand. Mac wrapped his free arm around Melissa.
You can lean on me, sugar. You look like crap.
I'm going to tell Jenny that you guys are horrible at flattery. He smiled at her attempt at humor.
She knows already, but seriously, your coloring is off. You look pale and a little sweaty looking.
I'm fine. Mac helped her down the hall, ignoring her protests. CJ jogged ahead and inserted a key card into the electronic lock. He drew his gun and opened the door. She moved to step behind him, but Mac held her in place.
Let him clear the room. Then we go in.
They waited outside while Mac scanned the hall.
Clear,
CJ said from inside the room. Mac released her and gave her a gentle nudge.
In you go.
Melissa stepped inside an opulent suite. A mini kitchen and sofa suite made up the main room, and a door led off to a bedroom. Mac carried in the 2 suitcases, shut the door, and latched the security bolt. She walked to the large picture window and pulled up short. Oh my, this view is spectacular. The last time she'd been in a hotel room this large had been 10 years ago on her honeymoon. She clutched her stomach as it churned. I can't afford this.
You're not paying for the room.
CJ pulled her into another hug. I'm not? He shook his head.
You're in police protective custody.
I am? Silly question, because that was obvious, but that didn't mean it felt real.
Don't worry.
He turned to Mac.
How much longer until her detail arrives? Not long,
Mac said.
Should be here within the hour. Good. Go talk to the hotel security and make sure they are briefed.
CJ leaned against the small counter of the kitchenette and fingered through the coffee choices.
I doubt he'll try to get her here.
A chill traveled down the center of her spine. He's coming for me. Mac put his hands on her shoulders and turned her to face him.
It only makes sense, but given his history of planning, he's going to need time to figure something out.
So, what do I do? Mac pointed to CJ.
You mind him. Do what he says. Don't leave the room. He's in charge until Jenny or I get back. You open the door for no one else, you got it?
She could only nod.
All right. I'm gonna go. Jenny and I have business.
He turned to CJ.
Can I have a word with you in the hall?
The two of them disappeared to the hall, and when CJ returned a few moments later, he made sure the security bolt latched. She took a step back, unprepared to see the heat in his gaze. It was gone in a flash, though. He banked his expression so quickly she wondered if she'd imagined it. She took in a deep breath and glanced around the living room, uncertain what to do next. CJ picked up the 2 suitcases and carried them to the bedroom.
Who knows what Jenny packed? Take a look and let me know if you need anything else. I'll either have Jenny get it from your house or buy it.
He put the suitcases on the bed. She followed, feeling hesitant and awkward. CJ unzipped the suitcases and opened them. He brushed the side of her cheek, then swept a strand of her hair back, tucking it behind her ear. Such a small gesture, she trembled.
Trust me,
he said.
You'll feel better after a shower.
It infuriated her how he had her entire body shaking with his tender touch. She balled her fingers into fists and fought a tear forming at the corner of her eye. He pulled her into his arms.
Melissa, you'll be okay.
The heat of his body melted any self-respect she had left. It didn't matter if he was only doing his job. She buried her head into his chest and inhaled his intoxicating scent, musky with the slightest hint of spice. Wrapping her arms around his waist, she let herself believe this incredible man could want the damaged goods she represented. It may not be the truth, but it didn't matter. She needed to be held, to be comforted, if only for a moment.
22. His shower. CJ. CJ breathed in Melissa's light scent, lilac and rose. She reminded him of the breaking rays of dawn, full of promise with the coming of the day. He clutched her tight as if holding her could protect her from the evil permeating her life. If she could find shelter in his arms, then maybe some of the horrors visited upon her could be pushed aside, if only for this moment. How one man could destroy the lives of so many infuriated him. In his line of work, it was easy to believe the war of good against evil would never be won, and the devil ruled the earth. Whenever he felt this sense of futility, he turned to the victims. Strong and resilient, he admired how they picked up the ruin of their lives and carried on. They reminded him to be strong and to continue the fight. Scott Patterson destroyed Melissa's life as surely as he stole the lives of his victims. Despite that, or in spite of it, Melissa pieced her life back together, much like CJ continued with his, moving with the pace of each day until a week turned into a month and months became years. Evil touched too much of his life, taking first his innocence, then his mother, and finally his sister. Yet he still believed he could change the world. Holding Melissa had him wishing he could do more, be more. What had it been like living with a serial killer, loving him, only to experience the ultimate in betrayal? A man who fixed things he vowed to solve her problem. Until then, he would provide comfort and support. Go take a shower, CJ said. You'll feel better. Or soak in the tub.
I don't want to.
I know, but there's nothing either of us can do right now. He lifted her chin and forced her to look at him. The cops are looking for him. The feds will be here soon. There's nothing to do except get some rest.
I think I'll just go to bed.
He placed his hands on her arms and lifted her away from his chest, just far enough to gaze into her eyes. Trust me, a shower will make you feel 10 times better."
I'm so tired.
He gave an easy laugh. "I don't doubt it. I'm surprised you're doing as well as you are." With a tiny shove, he got her moving. "Take a nice long soak. I'll be in the living room. If you don't mind, keep the door cracked. That way if you need anything, I'll be able to hear." She made her way to the bathroom, turning to call out to him as he headed to the other room.
In case I forget, thanks.
He settled onto the couch, shifting as he tried to find a comfortable position. It proved difficult because Melissa was in the other room, stripping for her shower. His pants tightened as he remembered undressing her in that garage. The swell of her breasts, behind the lace of her bra, fascinated him, and the flare of her hips begged for his hands to encircle her tiny waist. Those hips were built for a man's hands, designed for traction and to withstand his dominating need. Her breasts were the perfect size, neither too small nor too large. Pillowy soft, they promised comfort and pleasure. He leaned his head back with a sigh and adjusted his growing erection behind the zipper of his jeans. Soft sobs drifted to his ears. He jolted to his feet, ready to go to her, but forced his protective urges to the background. Crying was natural and expected after the events of the day. He left her to her grief, giving as much privacy as he could. A moment later, a thud sounded from the bathroom. The timbre of her cries turned frantic. This time, he didn't hesitate. He found her sprawled on the floor. Steam filled the room, and he had difficulty making out what he saw. She lay in an awkward pile, legs bent and her arm trapped beneath her naked body. Her long hair covered her face and draped her breasts and shoulders. Heavy bruising covered her body. Why hadn't she said anything? Shades of red, purple, blue, yellow, and green covered her from her collarbone to her hip. The bruising wrapped around her back and extended down her buttocks. What happened? An unnecessary comment, but he couldn't think of anything else to say. Her words were unintelligible. She gestured to her back, but he didn't understand what she was trying to say. He opened the shower door and knelt by her side. The water drenched his clothes. She was trying to push herself up. Without a thought, he sat beside her, collected her in his arms, and rocked her against his chest. She curled into him. After a time, her sobbing stilled.
I couldn't reach the soap, and then I fell. I couldn't get off the floor. It hurt so much.
Her body shook with her frustrated cries.
I can't even take a shower by myself.
It's going to be all right. Poor thing was overwhelmed. Hell, he was overwhelmed. Was he really cradling a naked woman in a shower? What the hell was he thinking? He knew what he needed to do, and hoped she understood his intentions were honorable. He set her on the floor, taking great pains to place her with care. The massive bruising on her body had him concerned. He moved the wet hair out of her face. Do you trust me? She wrapped her arms around her chest, shielding her breasts from his view, and pulled her knees up to hide everything else. Slowly she nodded. He pulled her to her feet, being careful not to cause her too much pain.
I couldn't get my arm to reach.
He placed a finger over her lips. You trusted me once before. Trust me now. She took in a shuddering breath, and her mouth parted. He placed his finger under her chin. I'll be the perfect gentleman. I'll help you soap up, wash your hair, and rinse you off.
You won't touch me?
A smirk lifted the corner of his lips. I'll have to touch to get you clean. Just think of it as a sponge bath, but in a shower instead. His gaze cut to the jeans plastered against his legs. I need to get out of my jeans, but I'll keep my boxes on. Her eyes widened.
You're taking your clothes off?
Not everything, but it'll make less mess to clean up later if I strip out of my shirt and jeans. Unlike you, I don't have a change of clothes.
You must think I'm a wreck.
I think you need someone to help you. That's not the same as being a wreck.
Have you ever washed a woman's hair before?
She kept her arms crossed over her chest, but she did a poor job of hiding her breasts. A pink nipple peeked out between the crossing of her arms. It took everything for him to keep his eyes focused on her face.
"It's not like running a bar of soap over your head,"
she said. He was happy to see some of her spunkiness return. Hair washing is one of my many skills. When I'm done with you, you'll feel like a new woman. She bit her lower lip. Oh, shit, I didn't mean it like that. Her gaze darted to the ground. He couldn't help but take another peek at her creamy skin.
"You won't do anything funny?"
Scout's honor.
"You're a Boy Scout?"
The look on her face told him she didn't believe him. You're looking at an honest-to-goodness Eagle Scout. Your safety is assured in my hands. He gave her a four-finger salute. She readjusted her arms, covering the flash of nipple he'd been staring at. I'm not promising perfection, but I promise I'll take care of you. With great reluctance, he brought his gaze back to her eyes.
"Thanks."
She shifted her eyes down, looking even more vulnerable. He wanted to wrap her in his arms and take her pain away. Why didn't you tell me you were hurt so badly? If I'd known, I would have taken you back to the hospital.
"I couldn't stand staying in that hospital a day longer. Besides, as long as I don't bend, twist, or move, I'm good."
The threat of tears wavered in her voice. He headed them off by placing his hands on her bare hips and his chin on the sweep of her shoulder. He loved touching her, and the smoothness of her skin reminded him of velvet. The heat of her body made his body answer with a burn of its own. With a whisper, he tried to soothe her. Well, let's just get through this shower. As awkward as that may be.
"You said you'd be a gentleman."
And I intend to honor my word. Not an easy task. He struggled not to stare at the swell of her breasts. I'm going to take my clothes off now. Do you think you can stand, or are you at risk for falling again?
"Standing isn't the problem. It's moving that hurts."
Divesting himself of the wet jeans proved more difficult than expected, but he hopped and tugged until he shimmied out of them. He stripped out of his shirt, leaving only his boxers in place. There was nothing he could do about the erection tenting his pants. She leaned her forehead against the wall, one hand splayed against the tiles, not even looking at him. Her other arm was wrapped around her waist. The rounded globes of her ass had him drawing a sharp breath. His cock twitched at the sight of her nakedness, hungry, needful, and wholly inappropriate. So fragile. With only his boxers to cover him, he stepped behind her and placed a hand on her shoulder, needing to touch her, not overwhelm her. He could only imagine the vulnerability she must be feeling, and the trust she extended him. CJ's heart hammered beneath his breastbone, and he reined in, the raging tide of lust surging through his veins. As awkward as she was when she moved, she relaxed into his touch. That gave him hope. A shudder passed through her body. He didn't know how he would make it through this shower. He'd be embarrassed if he broke his word, but he was determined to help Melissa. If he could keep his mind on why he was here and not on what he wanted to do, he'd make it through. But images of pushing her against the wall and burying himself balls deep kept flashing through his head. He needed to stop that line of thought before he burst. He needed to focus. She sighed.
"I hate feeling like this."
Try not to think about it. Here, hold my hand. Here he was again, stuck in hero land, worse than the friend zone as far as he was concerned. At least when he was in the friend zone, he knew where he stood. In hero land, he never knew what to expect.
23. Her shower. Melissa. Melissa's heart stumbled, unsure whether to race ahead or stop in its tracks. She was in a shower big enough for two, with the hero of her dreams standing half naked behind her. She felt all of him. His presence enveloped her, wrapped around her, and covered her in a blanket of support and something much more primal. The heat of his skin radiated out from him as if seeking her center and stoking a desire buried deep within. She wanted him, or wanted him to want her. She breathed deep, certain this was a dream, but knowing it was all too real. It would be nice to enjoy this moment. except for the excruciating pain. Of all her fantasies, none held a candle to what was happening now. But this wasn't a sensual prelude to sex. It was a pathetic weakness that brought him near. Story of her life, and it sucked. Her body was a twisted mess of muscles strained too far, and she'd seen the bruising when she'd undressed. She thought she could handle something as simple as a shower, but the floor tilted up and she crashed into it. And as she fell, memories of a more twisted time invaded her thoughts. The bruises and pain brought back the night of her first beating. She'd been married less than 2 years. A thunderstorm raged above her house. Flashes of lightning lit up the sky, and in between the booming thunder, tornado sirens pierced the night with their shrill cries. Scott hadn't finished the new tornado shelter. It didn't have a door. She was alone, waiting for Scott to come home. She grabbed the keys to the old shed, the one he ordered her never to go inside. The entrance to the old shelter was in there, a heavy door she could barely lift, but a door nonetheless. He said it wasn't safe, likely to collapse at any moment, but she feared the destructive force of a tornado more than a cave-in from an old storm shelter. With the wind roaring and the sirens wailing, fear gripped her gut. The new shelter wasn't ready, and she had to choose. She raced to the old shed and fumbled to open the trap door leading to safety. It might collapse inward, but it was better than facing a tornado in a shelter without a door. She didn't hear him yelling until he yanked her back, slapped her in the face, and knocked her to the ground. He kicked her in the ribs and screamed at her to never go inside the old shed. Scott dragged her back through the storm and across the expansive lawn to the new shelter. He threw her inside, and she crumpled, shivering against the cold concrete floor. Beyond the entrance, the storm howled and the sirens wailed. Confused and terrified, yet relieved to have her husband home, she didn't understand his rage. Her relief was short-lived, because he ripped screams from her battered body under the fury of his belt. "For your protection," he said. He punctuated each word with the swing of his belt. "The old shelter isn't safe," he said. She would discover that lie many years later. If only she made it to the old shelter before he came home. How many lives could she have saved if she discovered what he hid beneath the shed? She spent 2 days in the hospital under observation, and never ventured into that corner of the estate again. Not even when the police came 4 years later with a warrant, demanding she open that old shed. She thrust the keys at them, her hand shaking, unwilling to break one of Scott's rules. Only then did she learn for what vile purpose that shed and the bunker below it had been used. Tears ran down her cheeks with the terrible guilt from that night. If only she'd been quicker. If only he hadn't come home when he had. If only she had discovered the girls trapped inside. She could have saved them. She could have saved all the ones who had suffered and died over the next 4 years.
Hey, are you okay?
CJ leaned over her shoulder, his powerful hands gripping her waist. His calming presence helped her breathe away the horror of that night and anchor herself back in the present. Her tears flowed, but he couldn't see the terrible remorse. Ah, hell. What was she thinking? He was in the shower, stripped down to his skivvies, not naked, but close enough, and he was trying to comfort her. She pressed her palm against the tile, spreading her fingers in frustration. The rough tile pebbled beneath her fingertips, just as ugly and raw as she felt on the inside. CJ said a shower would make her feel better. He didn't mention he'd be joining her. Not that her falling down had been his fault. But she felt self-conscious exposed to his eyes. Was he looking at her ass? Did he like what he saw? Had he seen down there? She hadn't shaved or waxed in far too long. He must think her a primitive. She pressed her forehead against the shower wall and breathed out. His fingers dug deep into her back. The roughness of his hands caught on her skin, causing tiny shivers to spread out from each of his fingertips. He moved to her neck, hitting pressure points at the base of her skull. It hurt like crap, but the pounding in her head seemed to fade.
Does that feel okay?
He didn't ease the pressure.
Not too hot?
It hurts, she admitted. But whatever you're doing is making my headache go away.
That's what it's supposed to do. Try not to tense up.
Easier said than done. His fingers worked magic. He said he would only help her wash up, not give a massage. But she didn't dare stop him. Whatever he was doing felt heavenly. CJ's fingers pressed into her flesh, kneaded with expert precision, and attacked her knotted muscles with purpose. Beneath his touch, her body melted, taut muscles relaxing, the pain dissipated.
You've got a lot of knots,
he said. Melissa lifted her shoulders to her ears when he pressed on a particularly sensitive spot. He stopped rubbing.
Sorry, I didn't mean to hurt you.
No, it feels amazing. She stretched her neck. His hands pressed against her skin and his fingers continued their magical dance. He hit another sore spot, causing her to hiss and lift onto her toes. The deep pulls of his breath startled her, almost ragged and raw. He reached out to steady her.
Sorry.
No, it's okay.
I don't want to hurt you.
You're not hurting me, she said with some protestation. Okay, it hurts a lot, but it's the good kind of hurt. He collected her hair and straightened it down her back.
I love your hair.
It's a mess, boring and straight.
There's nothing boring or straight about your hair.
His fingers pressed into the muscles of her back, causing her to gasp as he hit yet another spot.
Stop?
No. She loved how he paid attention and adjusted the pressure he applied. His touch felt like fire and had her curling her fingers against the tile.
It doesn't work unless you let the muscles release.
She squinted against the pain. I'm trying. Her teeth clenched. With effort, she forced her shoulders down. CJ rubbed her skin, changing the deep muscle massage to a light surface caress. Once she relaxed, his fingers pressed in and held. She gasped in agony. He placed his cheek next to hers.
Breathe in and out. Give it a moment. The muscle will surrender.
She did. It was difficult. It hurt like hell. And it worked. As the water poured around them, the muscles in her shoulders relented under his touch. She lifted her head and breathed out, only to arch as he massaged the muscles along her spine. Holy crap, she cursed. CJ paused.
Stop?
She panted against the pain. It wasn't the good kind either. Tiny jolts of electricity traveled down her spine and wrapped around her ribcage. That doesn't feel right. Her body wasn't healed enough to manage that pain.
Okay, how about we wash this hair?
At that moment, the shower turned from slightly sensuous to mechanical and stale. The metallic taste of disappointment filled her mouth. Her shoulders slumped as the last bit of energy left her body. I guess, she said. Why not? What else were they going to do in the shower? She was naked, he was nearly so, and the long, hard length of him had bumped against her hip more than once. Was she crazy thinking sex might be in the picture? Did he even want her like that? It didn't seem like it, but there was his erection. Melissa pinched her eyes closed. Good thing they were in a shower. He would never see her tears of frustration. A coolness spread against her scalp. CJ had squeezed shampoo over her hair. You'll need a lot more than that, she said.
Really? 'Cause I put on a bunch.
She shrugged. He'd figure it out. She didn't move. He'd already seen far more of her body than she was comfortable with. She didn't mind if he saw her ass. There was nothing special about her flat ass. Honestly, as far as the sex went, if he tried to put the moves on her, their coupling would be the most uninspired lovemaking in the history of shower sex. At least CJ had the most divine hands ever created on Earth. The way he massaged her scalp had her head tilting back in ecstasy. He cupped the left side of her head in one hand, scrubbed with the other, and then gently rolled her head to clean the hair on the other side. He added more shampoo, rinsed it, then coated her hair in conditioner.
Time to wash the rest of you.
His gentle tone had heat rising to her cheeks. Another reason to face away. Before she could think how uncomfortable she would be, his hands lowered to her shoulders and drifted down her arms. He rubbed her arms, lathering her skin. His fingers circled her elbows, and he massaged her forearms, continuing the electric touch down to her wrists. His fingers passed over the backs of her hands, which she held stiff, unclear how she should respond. Then he circled around until their palms connected, and her heart rate spiked. His touch was sure and confident while she trembled. Their fingers interlocked and folded together. He brought his hands around to the front of her body, just below her breasts, encasing her in the surety of his embrace. Suds covered her, trailing down her skin in rivulets. He leaned against her, his chest sliding against her back. Their skin, slippery with the soap, heated with mutual arousal. His erection pressed against her skin and she gasped.
Sorry.
He shifted, angling his hips away.
It's, a natural reaction.
She screamed inwardly with silent frustration. That's not what she wanted.
You doing okay?
His question lingered. She bit her lower lip, not trusting herself to words, and nodded.
If I make you uncomfortable, do anything that crosses a line, you let me know, okay?
She nodded again. The hard length pressed against her hip. She released her lower lip and prayed her voice didn't shake. Yes.
I'm going to wash your front and back, and then I'll wash your legs. I have to touch certain places.
It's easier if we don't talk about it too much. Just do it. He released her hands and she let her arms drop to her sides. CJ's ministrations became efficient from that point forward. The shoulder rub had been a painful but exquisite experience, delivered with care and consideration. When he washed her hair, she could imagine he lingered because he enjoyed it as much as she did. When he washed her body, especially her most private places, he did so in a methodical manner. In less than half a second, his hands ran over her breasts. He lifted them like they were nothing and dropped them to move on. There wasn't even an attempt to brush her nipples with his fingers. He used a washcloth to clean between her legs as if he couldn't bear to touch her down there. Up and down her legs, brusque and businesslike, he continued to her backside with that same damn clinical efficiency. All the while, she closed her eyes and gritted her teeth as a constant and needy throb made her ache for more. Her cheeks burned, heated not from arousal or embarrassment, but from a deep frustration. She couldn't wait to end this agony.
24. Knives. Pierce. Okay, so the knives may have been a bad idea. At the moment, the fire in my belly had been a thing of legend. I roared with each slash, Gretel's screams pushing me to cut again and again. Thick and luscious blood poured out of her ivory skin, a liquid feast for my enjoyment. Complementing the piercing wails, my princess's cries crescendoed with each slice. I had punished them, and their fear fueled the adrenaline racing in my veins. It was like standing at the edge of a cliff. My lungs burned, and I teetered on the precipice of going too far. Blood cooled as it dripped down the handle of the knife to coat my wrist. It dried there, turning sticky, while I reveled in the whole experience. The metallic tang of blood filled the air. I inhaled it, tasted it. I couldn't resist taking one lick of the blood on my hand, and then I had another. The dripping crimson fascinated me. I rubbed the glistening slickness between my fingers, drawing designs on my flesh, watching cracks form as the blood dried. I felt powerful, strong, like I could do anything. All my princesses bowed before me, their resistance melting away before my supremacy. Power beat in my chest, burning along my nerves as it rushed along my limbs. He must have felt like this when he took his princesses. And, at the end, my essence exploded over her breasts, the ropey white strands mingling with the crimson decorating her flesh. I had chosen Gretel because I liked her the least. Her straw-colored hair and dull brown eyes completed an uninspired face full of freckles. She was the youngest, not yet 18. Her breasts were amazing, the feature which had drawn me to her. She barely moved, crumpled as she was against the back wall. The chains still bound her, and fine tremors shook her fragile form. Her task had been to teach a lesson to Henrietta, our fairy godmother, and she'd served admirably. Henrietta's training progressed with difficulty. She fought every step of the way. I'd spent a day slapping her around using the belt and the cane. We were in the early phases, and while I expected resistance, biting my cock had earned this punishment. She would learn her job was to protect my princesses, not subject them to further harm. She probably thought her punishment would be wrought out on her flesh. How wrong she had been. It was time to see if she had learned. I had her bound on the bed. The ropes were long enough for her to move about, but too short for her to stand. I wanted her to straddle me like she had our very first time. After the intensity of my release with Gretel, I had collapsed over my poor princess. Only then did I notice her unresponsiveness. I pressed my fingers to her neck and sighed with relief. The flutter of her heart still beat. Anger thrummed in my veins. This was our fairy godmother's fault. She had caused me to go too far. I stalked toward the bed, moving between the cages as my eyes cut left and right, taking in my cowering princesses. My feet pounded over the wooden floor, creaking as I went. I'd almost killed poor Gretel. Perhaps he and I were more alike than I thought. I turned my thoughts from him, and even from Gretel, who I'd left chained to the wall. I'd graced Gretel with my seed, and the act had left me drained. Time to replace Henrietta's gag, but first, we had much to discuss. I slapped her face, then gripped her chin and forced her to look at me. This happens when you misbehave. A fairy godmother sets the example. Your job is to protect them.
You twisted little man.
Her breasts heaved as she spat the words in my face. She'd already said something along those lines too many times. Honestly, she wasn't very original. I turned on the video camera and started the playback of our first time together. The clip played on a small television I'd brought down just for her. Do you remember this, my dear Henrietta? Do you remember fucking me with such abandon? I cued the video to the part where she had been riding my cock in my bedroom. Her breasts bounced. Her head was thrown back in ecstasy. Moans of pleasure spilled from her mouth as she rode me. My fingers clutched her thighs and my hips jerked with my release. Our first time had been glorious. Tears leaked from her eyes, and a flush of shame colored her cheeks. I rewound and placed the video on repeat. You're going to do that again? It had felt so damn good. Her sad eyes regarded me, cutting over my shoulder to look at what I'd done to Gretel.
Please, no.
I ran my thumb over her bottom lip. You will. But first, I'll try out your pretty mouth again. If she bit me again, I would move on to the next princess. I didn't want to repeat the last 10 minutes. My arm burned from the exertion, and the blood was flaking off my skin. I itched and needed a shower. Her head shook.
Please, just let us go. We won't say anything.
You know that won't happen. You will serve and show the same enthusiasm as our first time, and you'll never use your teeth to bite again. Do you understand? Fear shone in her eyes, and she cast her gaze around the room, taking in the rows of cages. I had 6 princesses, 1 fairy godmother, and 1 cage left to house my queen. As much as I disliked her, Gretel made me proud. She tried not to cry. Tears were forbidden down here. But when I'd carved the X between her breasts, she couldn't help herself. I didn't blame Gretel and wouldn't punish her for her weakness. That fault belonged to the proud woman tied to my bed. So let's talk about what's about to happen. The more I spoke to Henrietta, the more my dick grew hard. I want you to ride me. I want to hear you cry out as you come. You'll enjoy it, And if I come first, we'll move on to Cinderella and then the next. Her lids drew back, the smell of her fear rising between us. Do you understand? She broke, her chin tucking to her chest. Okay, I said, sheathing my erection in latex. Let's begin. She panted with her exertions, but I came before her climax crested. I placed my bloodied hands on her hips and glanced with a smile. My dear Henrietta, did you not understand? You were supposed to come first. I lifted her off me, removed the condom, and rolled from the bed. I would need time before I could use her again. Gretel drew my attention, so silent against the back wall. I went to her and cleaned her the best I could. Many of her cuts still oozed, and some went deeper than I'd intended. It looked like she might need stitches. I returned to Henrietta. Would you like to say anything to Cinderella before I begin? It was dangerous having 3 of them out. I could handle 2, but never had I controlled 3 at once. A glance at Gretel soothed my fears. She was in no condition to cause a problem. Henrietta's face turned ghostly white. Her mouth gaped as her breath hitched in her throat.
No, please! Please don't! I'll do better!
Her choked sobs made it difficult to understand her words.
Please, my prince, please, let me try again.
I want to watch you come. She knelt on the bed. Her legs quivered, her head sagged, and her arms stretched overhead. I reached out and rubbed at the muscles of her shoulders, knowing how fatigued they must be. Her joints must be on fire. She moaned as my fingers kneaded her flesh. I hugged her, giving the comfort she desperately needed. Brushing back the mess of her hair, I kissed her temple. She tensed, but didn't pull away, and she didn't nip at me. We were making progress. I picked up the knife. Same as before. Henrietta screamed as I carved an X in the flesh between Cinderella's breasts. Unlike Gretel, Cinderella never cried out, but I had trained her to endure. I put Cinderella back in her cage and checked on Gretel before returning to Henrietta. You know what I want. My hand went down to stroke myself. Her eyes followed my movement. She bit her lower lip, so sexy and plump.
Please, don't hurt them anymore.
I was spent, and it took time to get me hard. Henrietta did much better this time, grinding her hips. I would have preferred if she hadn't scrunched her eyes closed, but she worked hard to please me. She came long before the first tingle started in my balls. I would reward her effort. Rewards were important. The responsibility I had toward my princesses filled my world. I had a duty to them, to care for them, to provide for them, to see to their happiness. I took Gretel to the shower in the corner of the room and rinsed the blood from her body. I examined each cut, pulling apart the wounds. As I suspected, a few sliced into muscle. I would need to close those, which had me thinking of that nurse from the hospital. Gretel turned flat eyes to me when I finished toweling her dry.
Thank you, my prince.
My least favorite princess was my most compliant, rivaling even Belle's steadfast devotion. I kissed her on the nose. You have pleased me very much. Gently I carried her to her cage. Her eyes dropped to the floor as I locked her in. She deserved the best care. Not much later, I was outside the hospital, wondering if that male nurse was still on duty. I'd never taken a man before, but it shouldn't be a problem. I kept chloroform in my van, along with an assortment of other drugs. I'd been a Boy Scout. Being prepared was ingrained in everything I did. Rope and duct tape were stowed in the panels, more than enough to subdue him. If that didn't work, there was always my gun. I wasn't sure how to get him down to my dungeon, or what to do after finishing with his services. I mean, I knew, but I wasn't sure the best way to go about killing him. It was hard not to make a mistake when doing that. So much went into planning it. Here is where my mentor and I disagreed. I liked my princesses. I loved training them and seeing them well-behaved, sharing meals with them, having our little talks, and disciplining them when needed. Fucking was fun, too. That and watching with pride as they struggled to please me. I found killing difficult, whereas it came easy to him. Belle had been with me for well over 3 years. Gretel had been around almost 2. I couldn't get enough of my princesses and planned to have them for years to come. On the other hand, my mentor had been wasteful, keeping his for a week or 2 at most. He hadn't been able to control his urges. His work may have been elegant, pristine even, but wasteful in the killing. While I had learned much, his weakness had been what finally led to his capture. On the other hand, I had practiced my techniques, learning exactly how far I could push my princesses and how well they healed. It was an intricate dance when we knew our rules and our expectations. There was no uncertainty in my dungeon. No death. I vowed not to repeat his mistake and to control myself. Death was messy, but sometimes necessary. I made a list. Drugstore for bandages and antiseptics, the hospital to get the nurse, and I had yet to collect what had been promised. My queen was still missing. The universe continued to conspire against me, keeping me from what was rightfully mine. Taken into protective custody, I assumed. Where? They were vague on that and on what happened at her house, but I saw the tulips through the open door. My mentor was not dead, and he was out there. He'd better not think to take back my queen. She was mine, and I didn't share what was mine. 25. If only. CJ. Washing Melissa's body was an exercise in torture as far as CJ was concerned. Now, his cock was a hard, hot mess requiring attention of a particular nature. Melissa was exhausted after the ordeal in the shower, and he tucked her in bed, making sure she was comfortable. After checking the outer door was locked and latched, he closed the bedroom door and locked it. Then he headed back to the bathroom to clean up the mess of his clothes. He peeled off his wet boxers and turned on the shower, letting the steam build again. With the water spraying against his back, he grabbed the soap, then reached down. His balls hung low and heavy, and his cock throbbed with unspent need. He gripped his shaft and closed his eyes with the first firm stroke. Not in any hurry. He let his mind wander to what he would have done if things had been different with Melissa. He vented a deep sigh, and then leaned his head back to fantasize about how that shower should have gone. His hand couldn't provide the release he craved, but it served his need for the moment. The hot spray of his cum took off the edge, but he was still painfully aroused. Dissatisfied, he stepped out, his gaze landing on his pile of wet clothes. Wrapping a towel around his waist, he searched for his phone, grabbed his clothes, and left the bathroom. A quick search in the closet of the darkened bedroom revealed a cotton robe. With a quick swap of the towel for a robe, he left Melissa to sleep and headed to the main living area of the suite. A quick call downstairs brought a laundry pickup, and an extra tip ensured they would expedite the cleaning. Desperate for distraction, he thumbed the keypad of his phone. It was time for work. The phone rang 5 times before Mac picked it up. "What's up?" "How's it going?" CJ asked. "Not so good." His partner's voice sounded frustrated. "What do you mean?" The rope gaped in all the wrong places, and he gave up any attempt to cover himself, tossing the damp towel over his lap in case Melissa woke and came searching for him. "Cold trail," Max said. Irritation hung thickly to his words. "Your leads didn't pan out?" CJ frowned. "We never had leads." "What do you mean?" He leaned back and repositioned the towel. "Got a moment?" He glanced around the empty hotel room. "Melissa's sleeping, but before I forget, I need a change of clothes. Can you grab them from my hotel and bring them over?" "What have you been up to?" Mac teased. "Don't get excited, nothing happened." He shook his head and shut his eyes against the juvenile ribbing. "Aw, come on. I leave you in that hotel room with a beautiful woman and nothing happened?" CJ gritted his teeth. "You're asking if I took advantage of a woman who found a girl murdered in her home? Not only is her serial killer ex-husband alive, but he escaped prison and is coming after her. That's the woman you think I fucked? A long, stuttering pause followed. Several times Mac said something, but he never strung the sounds into something intelligible. CJ kicked his heel over his knee. Just tell me about our case. Asshole. Like I said, Henrietta Jones is a serviceman's widow. I read that in the files. He's a decorated war hero. Well, let's recap. Okay? A common technique. They would talk about their cases, never assuming the other knew all the details. It was amazing what the simple act of discussing a case turned up. Mac continued. 2 days after that storm blew through, she never picked up her kids from school. The principal called the police. Right. The police chief is a friend of Sam's, and with her husband being a small-town hero, it's a high-profile case. But with the storms, they didn't have anyone to work it. He called Sam, who put the guardians on the case. Right. The woman vanished. Nobody knows anything. Are you still downstairs in the lobby? Nah, Jenny wanted to talk to the girls. Where are you now? Social services group home. The girls don't know anything. Their mom walked them to school every day, did volunteer work, and picked them up when school got out. Mac gave an exaggerated moan. You should try sitting in one of these kitty-sized chairs and see if it doesn't pinch your ass. He couldn't imagine Mac getting half his ass into one of those seats. Mac continued. Typical background on the mother. Everyone loves her. She wouldn't hurt a fly, yada yada yada. The perfect mom. Any reason to think she would abandon the girls? None. Boyfriend? Lover? None anyone knows about. So why are they assuming an abduction? What else could it be? We're missing something. He leaned back and stared at the ceiling, trying to think. Have they identified the victim at Melissa's house yet? No. These are small-town cops, but the feds arrived a little while ago. They've got a whole team and are sending samples to their lab. CJ brushed his hand over the stubble of his jawline. I need a razor. I'll get your stuff. There was a slight pause while Max spoke to someone else. When he returned, CJ knew there was bad news by the change in his friend's breathing. No go on the protective detail. The locals are busy with another kidnapping and the feds didn't bring extra manpower. They can send for some, but it won't be until tomorrow. Another kidnapping? CJ sat up straight, alert. Patterson stepping up his pace. Not Patterson. A man was taken. Jenny says the cops have no one to put on the hotel. What do you want to do? When's the rest of our team due to arrive? Not until tomorrow. Okay. You and Jenny see what you can find out from the girls and keep me informed about Melissa's ex. I'll stay with Melissa. When you're done, I'd appreciate it if you could bring my stuff. You gonna tell me what happened to the clothes you were wearing? Mac teased. Now go on there. His gaze slid to the bedroom door, and his mind traveled beyond to the sleeping beauty in bed. Damn. He was aroused and uncomfortable again. It would be a very long evening and a longer night.
We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of Rescuing Melissa, the Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1. Written by Ellie Masters. Narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes.
Hello, this is Ellie Masters, sharing a free audio exclusive of Rescuing Melissa on YouTube. Rescuing Melissa is my first book in my Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialist series, a spine-tingling thriller and steamy romance all rolled into one. Chapters 1 through 25 are out and ready to binge. We're about halfway done, and new chapters will be posted weekly for your enjoyment. Make sure you don't miss out on the rest of Rescuing Melissa. Make sure that you like and subscribe to my channel for free. And don't forget to tap the bell, also free, to be notified when new chapters are posted for your audio listening enjoyment. In this installment, we take a bit of a pause. Melissa received quite a shock after she was discharged from the hospital and went home. There, she found the body of a brutally murdered girl laying on a field of yellow tulips in her foyer. CJ was right there by her side, protecting her from her psychotic ex, and he gets her out of there and to the safety of a local hotel. We also delve a little bit deeper into Pierce's corrupted mind. Writing his chapters was to put it mildly, difficult. He's creepy and crazy, malicious and mad, and his chapters never failed to send shivers down my spine while writing them. If you're enjoying this story, please share with your reading buddies and let me know what you think in the comments. I can't wait to read them. While waiting for more, you can check me out at elliemasters.com, and you can find all my books at elliemasters.com/Amazon. If you are a Kindle Unlimited subscriber, you can read all my books for free on Kindle Unlimited. Until next time, this is Ellie Masters bringing you the best of romantic suspense.